Welcome to the Summer Careers Festival, giving you a summer of career advice workshops delivered by Lyfeproof and WMCA. Our Find Your Future campaign is led by young people for young people. And all through this summer, we'll be talking about as many different angles into finding your dream career as we can fit in. So today, we'll be talking about why first impressions count with our guests, Marisha and Emma. So could I please ask you two to quickly introduce yourselves, starting with you, Emma?
Sure. So, yep, I'm Emma and I'm an enterprise coordinator. My job in a nutshell is I work with schools to help prepare young people for the world of work.
Thank you.
And hi everyone, I'm Marisha. I'm a broadcast journalist. I do my own radio show and work for the BBC, and I'm also an entrepreneur.
Thank you. So, as I said, today we're going to be talking about why first impressions count, and they are so important when it comes to doing interviews or just networking in general. So, if we move to the first slide, I just want to talk about quickly the science behind first impressions. So, our brain makes 1,000 calculations in the first 7 seconds of meeting someone, and it's not usually what you say that gets their attention first, it's visual. So as you can see here, it's your body language and your facial expressions that take 55% of that calculation first. And then it's what you say and how you speak, which is 38%. And verbal, the words we say are just 7%. So that shows that the way that you come across physically is what seems to get people's attention the most. So yeah, if we move on to the next slide. These are some times when you might need to make a good first impression. So as you can see here, you've got college interviews, meeting family or friends or your potential partners, meeting new friends, your first day of a job or at school, at a networking event, university interviews and job interviews, and so on and so forth. So you can see that there's so many different situations that you're going to need to make a first good impression. And our two guests are here today to help us explore those realities really and get us ready for the world of work and finding that job that you really want. So if we go to this slide, tips and tricks, I'd like to start by asking Emma, can you talk to us a little bit about the visual side of things, please?
Yeah, of course. And I think what you said, Leah, at the start there about the science behind, the impressions that you make on someone straight away, that's really interesting. And to see it in numbers, actually, when you start to think about how you portray yourself across to other people and what you think when you first meet someone, it just starts to make sense. I think that the idea that someone's made up their mind about you within those first kind of 10 seconds is really crucial. And so the visual aspect and side of things is, of course, really important. Obviously, you've got the tips and tricks there on the screen. But I think some of these are a bit more obvious and go without saying than others. But I guess what I would talk about to a young person thinking about going for their first interview is we've all had a situation where we've had someone who's maybe not made a very good first impression on us. And it's really important that I think we reflect on what it was about that interaction that made you feel that way. And it's likely to be to do with someone's body language, for example. Maybe they came in very close with their arms crossed, or maybe they had a bit of a scowl on, or they seemed like they were really flustered. And those things can all really start to build a picture in your mind quite quickly about someone. So I think thinking about what a bad impression that someone made on you in the first instance, but also then looking at someone who made a really good first impression and why was that? It's likely because they were open with their body language, they were smiling, and all of these things you can think about, I guess, when you think about going for your first job interview. I guess I would say with body language, try and be as open as possible, making good eye contact, and also gestures can be really helpful as well, using your hands to portray what it is that you're trying to get across. In terms of clothing, I think it can be really helpful to ask an interviewer for a dress code before you go along. A lot of places will expect formal attire, but some places might be more open to casual dress code when you go in for your first interview. And then in terms of grooming, I think one thing that you can sometimes forget is that if you arrive flustered or late, or you haven't mapped out your route, you can come across as possibly not being your best groomed self. So I think it's really important to maybe think about doing a trial run, think about how long it's going to take you to get there. And that can really start to help make sure that you arrive in a really positive way and you get your best self across.
Great, thank you. There was a point where you mentioned having open body language. For someone who wouldn't quite get what that means, could you give us a little bit of an elaboration, please?
Yeah, sure. So I think generally trying to keep your hands neutral. So if you're crossing your arms, if you're almost sinking into yourself, if you're feeling nervous, I think that's quite a natural thing to do, is to try and shut yourself away physically. And I think if you've got a cup in front of you, if they offer you a drink, accept a drink, because you can always then, if you don't know what to do with your hands, you can hold your drink in front of you. If you try and keep your arms by your side, or maybe just in front of you on the desk, if you're someone who fidgets quite a lot. But yeah, I think a really bad negative stance can be crossing your arms. And I think, again, that's quite a natural thing to do. So try and think about that and, keeping your arms by your side or in front of you.
Great, thank you. Marisha, could I ask you to please kind of go into depth about the vocal side of things and the verbal?
Yeah, of course. So I think the important thing when it comes to language is thinking really carefully about who you're speaking to. So, for example, an individual like myself, not so much cool with the kids. I may not understand some of the terminology that you would use, that you would use to talk to your friends. So I think what I would say to people more than anything else is really just think about your audience, and you don't want to not be yourself. So there isn't anything wrong with, when we speak to people, there will be certain phrases that we will use. There'll be certain things that will slip out quite naturally, and there's nothing wrong with that. But this is where preparation can help you to sort of think about what it is that you might want to say. Now, one thing I will say, and I'm going to kind of do this a little bit backwards, because there's a couple of points in the verbal aspect that I think really apply to vocal. So I think the most important thing that I would say to people is take time to think. Do that a little bit before the actual setting or interview, and think about the things that you want to get across. What do you want this person to know about you? Because actually, particularly if we're talking about job interviews, a lot of people, yes, they might be interested in your experience. Yes, they might be interested in your capability. But actually, if they're going to work with you on a day-to-day basis, and most of the time the person interviewing you is going to be someone who you would work with in some capacity, they've got to like you. So you want to make a point of thinking about what is it that you want to get across to these individuals. What aspect of my shining personality do I want them to see? And then, take that in with you, because not all aspects of interviewing is formal. And a lot of times we want to see your personality. We want to get a feel for who you are. And that's not about perfection. That's more about consideration. And I think it goes back to a point that Emma's making, that, for example, doing a test run to get to the location means that you're less likely to get there flustered. Likewise, if you think about the sorts of questions you may be asked, think about the kinds of answers you might want to put across to those questions, again, you'll be less flustered because you had chance to process it. So when the nerves kick in and all of those butterflies kick in, it's not going to throw you off course. And, a very good tip is speaking slowly. Actually, what speaking slowly does was two things. Firstly, it means it's easier for people to understand you. But secondly, it's thinking time. Gives you a chance to think. about the things that you want to say. So when somebody, and I can tell you from experience, when I've interviewed people and I've asked them a question and they've taken a moment to pause and to think about what they want to say, that's actually something that is, I see as a positive thing. It's not a negative. You don't have to rush into the answer. You don't have to, just because they've said it immediately. And if you need a bit of time, there's nothing wrong with saying, can you just give me a moment to think about that? And whoever's interviewing you will absolutely do that. So speaking slowly gives you thinking time. It gives you an opportunity also to put your point across more carefully. And then I think in terms of speaking clearly, again, if you know through general day-to-day interaction that people say, oh, you may have a tendency to mumble sometimes, or, you know, I will be honest with you, one of my bugbears is when people do what I call swallow half their sentence. So they'll say the first few words and you understand it, and then they kind of gulp the rest. To be fair, it's because my sister does it. Does that really, really well. And I'm like, I don't know what you said. So again, goes back to speaking slowly, but being slow helps you to be clear. And then when you're clear, you're getting your point across. And it goes back to this point about don't worry about perfection. There's nothing wrong with phrases like or, you know, like, or what have you. There's nothing wrong with that, because that's about you being you. And what you don't want to do is sanitize your personality so much that people walk out and don't get a sense of who you are. But at the same time, you just want to balance that when thinking about, you know, speaking in text language, which sometimes people do, or speaking in a way that isn't necessarily appropriate for the setting. And you know, as I say, just remember that, you know, older people don't understand these terms. We don't get it. So just be mindful of that. And, you know, in the same way that you wouldn't really want someone to interrupt you when you're speaking, try not to do that to them. And again, listen, because what can sometimes happen is we get into an interview situation and we're so keen to say everything that we want to say that what we don't always do is listen to what that person's doing. So don't be afraid, as I say, to take that time to listen. Goes back to the having a cup in front of you, which is a great prop. Nothing wrong with somebody asking a question and you picking that moment to sip your water or so on, so you've got time to decide what you want to say, you know. But most importantly, just be yourself. You know, what people buy is people. We don't necessarily just buy things, we buy people. So when you come in there with a beaming smile and enthusiasm and acting like you want to be there and that this is something you want to do, all of that will be felt by the interviewer, and that's the sort of thing that will take you forward. And the same thing is true when doing media interviews as well. We enjoy interviewing people who are happy to be there.
That's some great tips from both of you that I think don't just apply to going into work and going into those situations where you are, you know, trying to get something from someone, in this case a job, but just in general life. Like, people are so much more like pleasing to be around when they are genuinely feeling like they want to be there and they're open and like smiling with you and everything. So yeah, these like tips and tricks, guys, honestly, they're great, not just for getting yourself that career, but just, you know, getting yourself some great relationships with people. And we all know networking gets you really far in life. So yeah, moving on to the next slide, and thank you guys for those amazing answers. These are some questions that you may get just in life. So I want to start with you, Emma. If someone was to ask this question in an interview, how do you handle working under pressure? Could you give us some examples of some really good answers and some not so great answers, please?
Yeah, of course. So I've prepared a not so good answer. So I work really well under pressure. Working to a deadline really suits my style of working. I do try really hard not to be overwhelmed or flustered by high pressure environments. But overall, yeah, I think I work really well under pressure. So I think there's nothing particularly wrong with that answer, but I just think it sells yourself short by not being able to give an example. And it's definitely something that I used to do, especially if I hadn't prepared for different types of questions. So in terms of a way to perhaps answer this question, to really sell yourself and your skills, I would say I work really well under pressure, and it definitely suits my style of working to meet a deadline. An example of this is I've recently been working on a project that involved multiple stakeholders. And the reason this project was high pressured is because we were working to a very tight deadline. Now, the way that I went about that project was I put myself forward as a project manager, and I started by prioritizing the tasks. I broke things down into small chunks of work, and I went from there. I held regular meetings with stakeholders to make sure that everyone was communicated with in a good amount of time. The result of this was we had some really fantastic feedback from the students who took part. We had 3,000 students joining our event, and the senior management at my company now want to run this event in the future. So I think with that kind of answer, I've gone through a different kind of technique. So I've still got across the point that I work well under pressure and it suits my style of working, but I've got into a little bit more detail and I've given a solid example. Now, I didn't give too much in terms of too many details about what that event was, which I think is okay in most situations. But if you were going for an education job, for example, I'd probably talk a bit more about what that project was, as long as it was relevant. But there's always ways to show that those skills are transferable. But I think the key point is that I tried to go through using the rule of three, and some people also call it the STAR technique, to explain the situation, talk about the task that you were given, how you actioned it, how you went about it, and then round it off by telling what the result of that was. So yeah, hopefully that's answered the question okay.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think, like, listening to the first answer that you gave in comparison to the second one sounds significantly more impressive. Even though you're saying the same thing, really, it's just that answer, it gave so much more detail about what you actually achieved.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really good point for us as young people to understand. Like, it's not always what you did, it's how you sell it, basically. It's how you put it across that really makes the difference from, like, oh, I used to scrub floors, to, you know, something that's a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? Quantitative. So if you used to scrub floors, how many floors, how long did it take you, what cleaning products did you use, and all of that, like, be a little bit more specific and show that you paid attention at what you were doing. So yeah, thank you for that. That was a great answer. So Marisha, if I was to ask you to tell me about a time you made a mistake and how you dealt with it, could you give us an answer that is not particularly the best one in comparison to a good one?
Yeah. Now, this sort of question is actually a really popular question these days, and similarly to the last question, you want to think about these questions in the context of what they would call your competence. And what that's about is your capabilities. So when people are asking you these questions, that's really what they're asking you for. So in this sort of question, giving a work example or even a personal example, I think is perfectly fine. It doesn't always have to be a work example. You know, maybe you're fortunate to be in a position where you think, well, I haven't made any mistakes at work. And actually, that's the wrong answer, as it were, or not a great answer, because sometimes people say, well, actually, I can't really think of a time when I've made any mistakes at work. And you go, oh, okay, and they leave it there. Or they say, yeah, I made a mistake with an order recently, and how I dealt with it was I told my manager about the mistake and then they helped to correct it for me. Because, again, actually, very often that may well be true. But here's what I would say, and again, it goes back to the brilliant point that Emma made. And to be honest, I would hire her based on that second answer, by the way. But what you want to do is, even if it's something that you don't think applies, or even if it's something that you can't think of an example for in that moment, because that can happen and you can get a bit flustered sometimes, is you want to tell people what you would do. So you could say, well, actually, based on the work I have done so far, fortunately, I haven't really made any mistakes. But if I did make a mistake, let me tell you how I would deal with it. And, what I may choose to do is to inform my manager of what's actually happened, explain to them how it's happened and why it's happened that way, work with that person to create a solution and to work through the problem. And I'd be very keen to see it through to the end to ensure that it's dealt with properly. And then after that, I would look to learn from that mistake, in part so I don't make that mistake again. And secondly, so that maybe I could stop other colleagues or other people maybe from making that sort of mistake if it's easily made. So even though you can't point to, in that example, a specific mistake, what you can do is give the interviewer some insight into the way that you would deal with it. Because in essence, this question's really saying, if something goes wrong, what do you do? Do you sweep it under the carpet and pretend it hasn't happened? Do you stand there and go, oh, this is not my problem, somebody else has got to fix this? Or do you seek to create a solution and learn from it? And, you probably want to be demonstrating the latter. If you have made a mistake, because, most of us have, and I know I certainly have, then I would say there's a bit of a balance here, okay? So you want to try and maybe refer to what I would call a middle of the road mistake. And what I mean by that is, we don't want to be, well, I made a mistake and burnt down the building. That might okay? But at the same time, you don't want to say, oh, well, I made the mistake and I forgot to pop a receipt in a bag for a customer, and and so they came back and said, oh, you forgot to give me that receipt. And I said, oh, okay, yes, there you go, there's the receipt, and that's that. Because what you're not doing, well, firstly, you're not demonstrating any skill, and secondly, like I say, with really stark issues, you can scare people. So a middle of the road mistake could be, oh, I was following a process at work and I accidentally missed a step, and because I missed a step, then it turned out that when we thought everything was finished, it wasn't quite finished. But actually, how I picked up that mistake, or how I realized I made that mistake, was because I was checking my work. That's another quality they'd want to see. And when I checked my work, I realized I'd made that mistake. So, the first thing I did was, obviously I went back and I corrected it and made sure that I'd done the process properly and completed things properly. But because it's one of those really little things that I realized was really easy for me to forget, I decided to just create a little checklist that I popped on a post-it note, and I put it on my desk in front of me, or I put it on my workstation in front of me, so that, each time I go through that, it just prompts me so I don't forget to do that again. Again, you've gone through a process of demonstrating you can create a solution, that you can learn from the mistake that you've made, that you can then build on that to alleviate any other problems in future. So, you sort of want to be able to articulate or explain to people in the main that things will go wrong, but you'll stick with it, you'll try to solve it, and that actually, most importantly, you'll learn from it. Because anybody who tells me that they're learning from things that have happened, I know reflects on the work that they do, cares about the work that they do. And again, I'd be more inclined to want to work with them.
That's really, really great insight there. Thank you, Marisha. I think when you were talking about being able to just be honest about what you've done, but like thinking about the gravity of what that mistake was, or even being able to say like you didn't make one and explain how you would deal with it. Because I think a lot of us as young people get really scared of being honest in that situation, saying, well, yeah, I have messed up, because we don't want to scare our future employer away, or we don't want to look like we're incompetent. But just knowing that there's ways to like have that conversation in the right way, or at least look at what skills you do have and insert them really intelligently into your answer, is a great way of just reminding the employer of what you're capable of. and making us less scared of answering that question. So yeah, thank you again, both of you, for that, because I think that's a lot of really good insight for two really scary questions to receive at interview. Like, they are really, really scary questions. So yeah, hopefully for you guys watching, hearing those two answers just will help you prepare for that a little bit better. So yeah, just a few things to remember. If we move on, thank you. So yeah, do your research into the company that you're going to be interviewing for, like what kind of questions they might ask, what kind of candidate they might want. So do either of you want to kind of elaborate on that point for me, please?
Yeah, this is something that we talk to students about quite a lot, because I think research skills are one of the most important things you can gain in school, especially in careers type activities in schools. I think sometimes it's slightly overlooked a little bit how important this is. But doing your research about what kind of questions they might ask, and sometimes these can be very specific to certain industries or types of jobs. And I think there's so many good websites out there that can help you prepare for the type of question you're going to be asked. Some of them are going to depend on the type of job that you're going for. You might be asked about the different kind of soft skills that you have. Most people will have questions around that to do with communication and teamwork, but obviously being prepared for those kind of harder skills type questions. So making sure that if you're going for a job in coding, you're probably going to be asked about a particular coding program. If you're going for a job in customer service, you might be asked a question about how you deal with customers. So making sure that you do the research into if the type of role you're going for, what kind of questions are asked of that role. And if you just Google that and look on websites like Glassdoor, you will find those kind of answers. But yeah, the transferable skills type questions, like Marisha was saying earlier, those two questions that came up earlier, they're quite common ones, and you will find a list of questions on the internet on various different job websites that will go through common questions that you will be asked in interview. And it's always worth just having a few answers in the back of your mind for various types of questions that you can then take a second, have a think, what have I prepared for these type of questions, and then you can go through your answer.
Great, thank you. Sorry, Marisha, were you going to say something?
What I will say is that having some knowledge about the company that you're going into is really, really important, particularly these days, because accessing that information is really easy. So please be careful with that. I mean, to tell you a little bit of a horror story, I remember once doing some interviews with a business partner years ago. We were looking for someone in admin, I think, sales and admin. But the long and short of it is that her first question to everyone was, what do you know about the company? And there was one young lady who said, I'm not really too sure. I didn't really get a chance to look anything up before I came here. And now I personally would not do this, but my colleague terminated the interview at that point and said, I don't see how you're going to work for us if you don't know who we are. And what would make you want the job if you don't know what this is. So, I would just say doing research into the company is really important. And it's not about you going in there and being able to recite everything that the business has done for the last 5 years. It doesn't have to be a research project in the context of maybe what you would study at university or in school, but it's having a basic idea of what industry they operate in, the types of work that they do, maybe a bit of an idea of who the customers are or the types of product and service they offer, which all of that sort of stuff you tend to find on a company website. And even if it's just someone who you're doing a bit of work experience for, and a really clever thing to do is then, as you're talking, particularly when you're explaining skills, even saying something like, oh, and I saw on the website that your company really prides itself on excellent customer service, and that's something that's really important to me too. Just inserting that sort of thing just says to the interviewer that you have taken a moment to understand the environment you're going to be in and thought about how you can apply your skills to that. So it doesn't have to be huge amounts, but go in there with some idea of who they are.
Great. No, thank you for that. Oh, we have a question. How do you answer the question, tell me about yourself, without sounding arrogant, but also telling all the skills and qualities you have? That's a great question. So yeah, I'll ask Emma first. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is likely to be the first thing that most people will ask, and it is an opportunity to get a bit of your personality across as well as your background. I think the part of that question about saying not telling all about the skills and qualities you have, that is quite important, because you want to save something up for those questions that you've prepared for as well. But I think you need to prepare almost a statement about yourself, which could be your background. So have you just finished school? What your interests are? What is it that your area of interest is career-wise? You could say a little bit about it doesn't have to be all just work-based and professional. You might want to talk a little bit about, are you local? Did you grow up around the area that you're applying for the job? You could mention there a little bit about why you're interested in the job. Maybe don't go too in depth in case that is the next question, but it's a good chance to say why you're interested in that company, in that job. But yeah, you could talk a little bit about your personality as well. At that point, you could say something that you enjoy doing outside of work as well.
Okay, thank you.
That's a question that definitely I agree with Emma completely, is really about balance, and is a great time to tell people a little bit about you. Again, this is sometimes where research can come into things. So for example, it's not always the case that you'll get insight into who will be interviewing you, but if you're able to do that, and to find out the name or names of the people, look them up on LinkedIn. See if you can see a little bit about them, because again, it can be a great time to share maybe the sorts of things that you have seen they might be interested in. So if you've looked on someone's LinkedIn profile, let's say, and they've obviously that's a business setting, but they might have popped in there, a book I recently read. And if it's genuinely a book that you've come across or something you've heard about, there's nothing wrong with slipping things like that in. People gravitate towards people who they think are like them. So I would say that, telling people, frankly, how great you are isn't really arrogant. What it's about is creating a connection between you and that person. So when you're telling them about yourself, you want to do it in a way that demonstrates, I think, two really important points. One, that you have a sense of who you are. And I know that might sound really strange, but that's why Emma's point about preparing a statement, I think, is really important. Because if you're a bit flustered or a bit nervous and somebody says, oh, tell me about yourself to get things started, and you go, oh, well, I don't really know.
Yeah.
They think, well, okay, it means I'm not going to get a sense of who you are. And it's really easy. I've been there. Somebody will say, tell me 3 skills about yourself. And I suddenly think, I don't even know if I have any skills. and panic. So sometimes you want to put a bit of thought into it so that you're able to do that. But use that space to also share, interests. And even sometimes hobbies or interests that might actually have complementary skills to the job that you're there to do. So, for example, do you play a sport, or are you part of a team, or are you in some way, shape or form, do you play a musical instrument, and are you part of a band, for example? Because you might say, oh, I'm a guitarist, and I play with a few friends on the weekend, and every so often we'll do a gig. You might think that that's you just telling them who you are, which it is. That's great. But what it also would say to me, as someone who wants to work with you, oh, so you're a team player. Okay, so you can collaborate with people. Oh, you're used to being around people. So don't be afraid to share those elements of yourself in a way that actually makes them realize that there's more about you. And then particularly if you're spotted on their social media, on the Facebook page or something, that they're in a band too, or they like a little bit of karaoke, it's the sort of thing then that it's kind of going to hit home with that person. Do you know what I mean? So sometimes just finding out a little bit, if you can, about the people around you. And if not, just being open about the things you engage in that show that you have balance. Everybody wants to see that, yes, it's great that you work hard, but we also want to see that you know how to relax. It's balance. So, nothing wrong with sharing that. Or, I love swimming and something I've done for a long time. It might seem a little bit left, but actually it gives a sense of who you are. And then before you know it, the employer goes, well, yes, and I bring my little girl swimming every week, and and you start up a conversation, So I think Emma makes a great point. Prepare a statement, but don't be afraid to put a bit of personality and a bit of zhuzh into that statement. It doesn't all have to be about the job, because they're going to ask you about the job later on anyway. I hope that helps, Anna.
Great. And I hope that helps anyone else who's also worried about that question, because that's one of the worst questions for me to get as well, personally. I cannot stand that question, because it is, like Anna was saying, it feels like arrogant. I think that's something a lot of us young people grew up being told not to be. Don't be arrogant, and don't toot your own horn. So sometimes that question seems really difficult to actually really grasp how to answer correctly without being like, yeah, I'm the number one football player in the class. Like, you want to expand upon that. So yeah, thank you both for that.
Actually, though, sorry, Leah, you make a really valid point in that sense. And what I would say, again, just going back to balance, there's nothing wrong with telling people the things you're not so great at if you're engaging in them. So, sometimes, and I say sometimes, in the past, I've given up now because I'm rubbish with languages. But in the past, if people have said, oh, tell me a little bit about yourself, and I'll say to them, well, I'm trying to learn a little bit of Spanish. And they'll go, oh, you speak Spanish, do you? No. I'm actually very good at it, but I'm trying to learn it because, it's interesting to me. I like the sound of the language. I'd love to be able to speak another language, but I'm not really that great yet. Hopefully one day, because again, it's not always just going, I'm great, I'm great, I'm great. That's about who are you? And sometimes showing that you're willing to try things that you're not even that brilliant at says a lot about your personality. So it makes a good point, but you can balance it. You could always say 3 great things and then 1 slightly less great thing, and then it's not arrogant at all.
That's great. Thank you. So yeah, just a couple more things to remember, guys. Your online resources. So I know that most young people at this point we're all using TikTok and Instagram. So remember that you can go on there follow yourself some recruiters, or some of these influencers that speak about getting yourself a job and how to come across like happy and positive. Google sales techniques, because earlier on we were speaking about body language, and when I did sales when I was young, one of the main things I've never forgotten is smile, eye contact, excitement, C factors. And that has always made me have such a confidence when I walk into interviews or like any sort of situation where I'm a little bit nervous. I just remember smile, eye contact, excitement, seem like, hi guys, I'm really ready for this interview. Like, I can't wait to do this. And it really goes a long way. So yeah, follow you some TikTok recruiters and people who speak about how to have the right mindset and the right body language in these situations. Remember, there's YouTube as well, people giving out tips and tricks all of the time. We're giving out tips and tricks all the time, so make sure you subscribe to us on YouTube as well. There's plenty of websites you could just hashtag recruitment or job interviews, search them on Twitter, search them on Google. There's a wealth of resources for you guys. Also, if you need help with careers and advice, mock interviews and so on and so forth, there's career services. So you've got in Birmingham and Coventry, there's the Job Shop, and in Sandwell, you have Connections. So if you guys have any more questions, make sure you pop them in the chat now. And I'm going to just thank our guests so much, because you guys have been amazing. You've given us some really great, just ideas into how to come across great in our first impressions. So before we do go, I'd like to ask if you guys got anything that you want to just kind of remind everybody before we go?
I was just gonna say Marisha's point earlier about taking a second to answer. And when I first started going to job interviews, I used to talk really, really quickly and think, I've got to think of something immediately. And someone advised me, actually, if you need a second, just take a sip of water. And it's one of the best pieces of advice I've ever been given. And it really does. Those extra few seconds to have a think really helps. And the final thing, I think, is that just remember that when you go to an interview, the interviewers want you to do well. They are actually hoping that you answer things in the way that, you know, they want to hear. So some people think that interviewers are out to try and trick you. You know, the best companies that you want to work for are not trying to trick you. They're not trying to, you know, trip you up. So just remember that they want you to do well as well.
Definitely. And you know, there's ways that you can almost practice as you go along in life. So you don't always have to wait till you get into that interview to say, you know, or how do I feel and what have you. When in my early days, you know, I used to get my mom. I mean, to be fair, she's sort of my biggest critic, in all honesty. So I used to get my mom to kind of, you know, maybe ask me questions. She's had enough job interviews. She knows what it's like. So she would ask me the sorts of things that people have asked her, you know, and give me pointers on maybe how to put myself across, particularly when it's someone who knows you. So don't be afraid to ask for help from friends and family, and to maybe do a little bit of role play or practicing with them, or just saying, you know, how would you answer this? Or, you know, mom, dad, they're probably going to ask me about, you know, 3 of my top qualities or skills. Well, what would you say about me? What 3 things do you think I do well? Because some of those things can help to get you thinking and help you to sort of formulate your answers and formulate ideas. I think the biggest thing is just be yourself. Be yourself. You know, it's really easy to think, particularly if you're going into a corporate environment for the first time, or a very formal or technical environment that maybe that you're not used to, that you have to put on a facade and pretend to be something that, you know, you're not comfortable being. You don't. People want to work with great people, and don't think that because you're young, you're not valuable, because you absolutely are. And you can bring skills and attributes and ideas and creativity very often into a space in a different way that, you know, us older folk, you know, don't do as well, or are coming at it from a different angle. So don't underestimate your value. Be yourself. Be prepared to just put yourself out there. And I think, Leah, I think you said it best when you said, you know, smile, great eye contact, show that enthusiasm, and you'll do well. And if it doesn't work out, because not every interview does, don't take it harshly. If you can get feedback, ask for it, because sometimes that can give you a bit of insight. And, you know, just take that learning to the next one, because you'll end up in the place where you need to be.
Great. Thank you both so much for everything. This has been a great talk. Again, I love doing these lives. I can't lie, guys. So yeah, next week, make sure that you tune in. We'll be having some more lives to keep up with when they'll be happening. Make sure you follow us on the Lyfeproof UK social medias. And if you'd like to get involved, you can email us at hello@lyfeproof.co.uk. But make sure you guys stay tuned for all the rest of the lives that we have going on for the rest of the summer to help you guys find your future. All right, thank you, and we'll see you next week.
Take care. Bye.